In the soft hush of a medieval countryside where the fields rolled in gentle waves beneath pale skies, people lived their lives quietly, guided by rhythms of dawn, dusk, and the slow turning of seasons. And among the many customs that shaped their days, how they ate, how they slept, how they worked, there existed a world of beauty standards that drifted through the land like faint fog, influencing everything, yet spoken of without urgency, without excitement, almost as if the very topic were meant to lull one into a peaceful doze. In those times, beauty was not a loud spectacle but a sleepy murmur, something observed in passing as one might notice a lantern glowing dimly behind a cottage window at night. The medieval villagers, with their soft woolen garments and long, unhurried days, lived by beliefs as old as the cobbled stones beneath their feet. Their ideas about beauty were woven from stories, traditions, and quiet observations of nature. Pale skin, for example, was considered especially desirable, so pale that it seemed untouched by sunlight, like milk poured into a wooden bowl. It wasn't because of grand theories or mystical explanations. It was simply a sign that a person didn't have to work beneath the blazing sun all day. And so people admired it in the same way they admired a well-baked loaf of bread or a neatly stacked pile of firewood gently, without much excitement, as though beauty were just another part of daily life. In the towns and villages, women often sat by candlelight, slowly grinding crushed chalk or flour between their fingers. They would dab it onto their faces with quiet, patient motions, creating a powdery mask that gave them the pale look so gently admired. There was no rush. The candles flickered lazily, the room smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke, and the soft powder drifted on the air. It was not glamorous, not thrilling. Just slow, repetitive, almost hypnotic, like the soft brushing of fabric against fabric. Eyebrows, too, held their own peculiar place in medieval beauty. Some believed that a smooth, high forehead was a sign of nobility and grace. And so, with the same calmness one might use to pluck feathers from a chicken, people would remove stray hairs from their brows, creating wide, open foreheads that seemed to stretch like pale hills under the dim morning light. There was no vanity in the act-only habit, a gentle following of what everyone understood without question. Hair floated down backs like softened threads of flax. Long hair was admired, of course, because it suggested patience and ability to care for something over time. Women brushed it slowly, drawing wooden combs through the strands with motions so repetitive and soothing that one could drift into sleep simply watching them. The combing sessions could last for hours, often done in silence except for the quiet rasp of wood against hair. It was a ritual of calmness, a peaceful pastime beneath roofs that creaked softly in the wind. Men held their own quiet expectations. Broad shoulders were considered strong, dependable, a promise that one could carry burdens without complaint. Yet no one spoke about such things with intensity. Instead, villagers would make passing comments while sharpening tools or mending nets. "He looks strong enough to lift the cart," they might say. Their voices gentle, their eyes half drowsy. A weathered face was respected. It meant a man had lived, worked, and endured, and endurance was its own quiet kind of beauty. Even gait and posture were part of medieval aesthetics. A slow, steady walk suggested thoughtfulness and reliability. People admired such movement, not with applause but with simple nods, acknowledging it as one acknowledges the consistency of a river's flow. Beauty was not a spark, it was a low-burning ember that glowed softly, constantly. Then there was the matter of hands. Hands were windows into a person's life. Smooth hands were associated with nobility or religious devotion, while calloused, earth-stained hands revealed labor and livelihood. Yet instead of envy or judgment, people looked at one another's hands with the same mellow acceptance they held for the different shapes of stones or the various songs of birds. Beauty in the medieval world was not a contest. It was just another aspect of existence, like the slowly turning water wheels or the drifting smoke from chimneys at dusk. Clothing played a part too, though not with vibrancy or drama. Wealthier individuals sometimes wore rich fabrics, embroidered gently with patterns of vines or flowers. But even the wealthy moved with a certain slowness, their garments swaying quietly, like curtains stirred by a faint breeze. The poor wore wool, coarse and simple, but they often believed true beauty was less about thread and more about the way a person carried themselves. Soft-spoken, humble and steady. Perfumes and scents whispered through the houses of those who could afford them. Lavender, rosewater, sage, nothing overpowering, nothing bold. Just light fragrances drifting like distant memories. In small cottages, herbs hung from rafters, giving the air its own sleepy aroma. Beauty and scent was not about standing out. It was simply about blending gently into the calmness of one's surroundings. Some of the more peculiar medieval beauty beliefs seemed almost designed to lull a listener into drowsiness. For example, roundness of face was often admired because it symbolized health and good fortune. People believed a soft, full face showed that someone had been well fed and properly cared for, and so roundness itself became a sleepy little symbol of comfort. The fuller the cheeks, the warmer the impression, like looking at freshly risen dough or plump apples stored for winter. Most medieval people found beauty instead in sincerity smiles that were shy, humble, or simply warm. But even these stories were delivered in steady, gentle rhythms, as though meant to calm as much as entertain. Villagers listened while strands of steam rose from their cups of broth, their eyelids growing heavier with each verse. Beauty in these tales was always described quietly: a lady of soft complexion, a knight with steady eyes, a maid with hair like morning light. Nothing fiery, nothing fierce, everything mellow. In monasteries and abbeys, manuscripts described virtues far more than physical traits. Humility was beautiful. Kindness was beautiful. Softness of speech was beautiful. A calm temperament was considered more lovely than any jewel. Beauty shifted with the weather without debate, like leaves changing color or snow slowly melting. And so, as the candlelight dimmed in cottages scattered across the countryside, medieval ideas of beauty continued drifting softly between the people, shaping their days without urgency. The villagers moved through their routines almost as though guided by an ancient, tranquil rhythm that never quickened, never startled, and never asked for more than a gentle awareness of what was considered pleasing or proper. They simply accepted beauty the way they accepted the slow growth of moss on stone or the quiet creak of wooden shutters in the wind. In the still evenings, when the sky turned a muted shade of violet and smoke curled lazily from rooftops, people would sometimes gather around the long wooden tables in their homes. There, while eating their simple meals, they would observe one another in the soft firelight. The flames flickered upon faces, subtly highlighting the pale skin that was admired so quietly. Nothing was said outright because beauty was rarely discussed directly. It existed in the spaces between conversations, in the slow glances shared, in the quiet nods of appreciation when someone entered the room in a way that matched the calm ideals of the time. Young women often tied ribbons in their hair, though the colors were not bold, nothing bright or startling. Soft muted tones were preferred, faded blues, dusty greens, gentle creams. These ribbons floated behind them as they walked, brushing softly against their backs. A ribbon that matched the hair well, or sat straight and level, was considered a small but pleasant detail. Villagers admired such things silently, without fuss, much like they admired the careful arrangement of apples in a basket, or the way smoke curled perfectly from a chimney. Even the way someone sat mattered. A straight posture suggested discipline and grace, something subtly respected. In dim halls and cold stone rooms, one could often see figures sitting upright, their shoulders relaxed yet properly aligned, their hands folded in their laps. This quiet posture became part of medieval beauty, not a strict rule, but an unspoken preference, understood and shared by all. The sound of footsteps also held meaning. Slow, steady steps echoing across stone floors seemed to carry a certain elegance. People who walked calmly, who did not shuffle too quickly or stomp too loudly, were seen as refined. This was not a loud admiration. There were no compliments given, no obvious praise. Instead, it existed in the near-invisible glances exchanged during gatherings, in the subtle tilt of a head acknowledging someone's gentle presence. Eyes held their own place in medieval beauty, eyes that appeared soft, calm, and thoughtful. A piercing or fiery gaze was rare and often considered unsettling. But eyes that looked like still water, eyes that reflected candlelight quietly, were seen as lovely. People valued steadiness more than spark, serenity more than intensity. Even laughter was expected to be soft and demure, never bursting too loudly. A calm laugh was considered more elegant, more fitting with the gentle rhythm of the time. The countryside played a role in shaping these expectations. The constant quiet hum of nature, the slow babble of streams, the rustle of leaves moving at an unhurried pace became the backdrop for human behavior. Beauty aligned itself with the land around them. People admired others the way they admired the peaceful flow of a river, without excitement, without intensity, simply with long, sleepy appreciation. Even sleep itself influenced beauty. Medieval people believed that rest brought a calmer temperament, a gentler face, and therefore a more pleasing appearance. They preferred those who looked rested, whose eyes did not dart too quickly and whose expressions were softened by long nights. The dim mornings, filled with mist and dew, gave everyone a dreamy look that seemed to match perfectly with what the era found lovely. Hands again were quietly important. A person with careful, graceful hands that moved gently while weaving, stirring a pot, or mending fabric was admired for the peacefulness in their movements. Medieval life required patience, and hands that reflected this patience were a small symbol of beauty. People often watched one another working without realizing it, absorbing the calmness of these motions as though hypnotized by their steadiness. Many believed that true beauty came from modesty. Flashiness, boldness, or loud fashion choices were considered unnecessary disturbances. A modest appearance allowed the personality's softness to shine through, and many saw this as far more beautiful than any outward decoration. In this way, beauty became almost invisible, something felt rather than seen. Buyers moved slowly through the stalls, their eyes wandering from cloth to fruit to pottery in gentle sweeps. Even in the busiest parts of town, something drowsy hung in the air, as though people preferred observing life rather than rushing through it. Young girls practiced walking with balanced baskets on their heads, learning the slow, controlled steps that would one day be admired. They brushed their hair hundreds of times in long, repetitive strokes. They applied light powders made from herbs and chalk, tapping them gently upon their skin. These rituals felt more like preparing for sleep than preparing for admiration, and the noblemen, for their part, trimmed their beards and hair carefully. Even during festivals, those rare moments of celebration, beauty did not become loud or extravagant. As the medieval nights grew longer and the rhythms of daily life continued their gentle, unchanging pace, the idea of beauty wove itself more deeply into the quiet fabric of the villagers' existence. It was not a concept that anyone needed to chase. Instead, it came to them naturally, drifting through their thoughts as softly as dust drifting through a beam of morning light. In the heart of many villages stood small wooden bridges stretching over lazy streams. People would cross these bridges in slow, careful steps, and the way they carried themselves while doing so was often seen as a reflection of their inner grace. Someone with a steady, patient walk appeared serene, and this sense of serenity became its own form of beauty. The water below moved at an equally gentle pace, mirroring the villagers' calmness and adding to the sense that everything people, land, and time itself moved with a shared sleepy rhythm. On warm afternoons, elderly villagers would sit outside their homes, weaving baskets or mending nets. Their hands worked slowly, their movements practiced, and many younger people admired the calmness that came with age. Wrinkles were not something to hide. They were seen as gentle marks of time, soft folds in the story of a person's life. Each line carried memories of laughter. Winters survived and fields plowed. The villagers understood that beauty was not confined to youth. Instead, it could deepen with age, growing quieter yet somehow richer, like a song sung softly through generations. Children too admired this peaceful wisdom. They often sat near their elders, watching the steady rhythm of their hands, learning the patience that medieval life required. In this world, even learning was slow and soothing. There were no urgent lessons, no hurried corrections, only the quiet repetition of actions passed down like whispered stories. Children came to see beauty not as something reflected in mirrors, but as something reflected in behavior, in the way their elders listened, spoke, and moved. Mirrorless beauty was perhaps the hallmark of medieval life. Most villagers rarely saw their own reflections except in the shallow shimmer of a basin or the still water of a pond. This meant beauty wasn't examined closely, wasn't compared or magnified. Instead, it became something felt, something sensed in small moments. The way someone's hair caught the breeze. The way candlelight softened the edge of a cheek. The way shadows danced across a person's face as they laughed gently. It was a world where people did not scrutinize themselves or others. The absence of mirrors made beauty less of a pursuit, and more of a drifting presence, always there yet seldom named. Even the environment played a sleepy role. Long stretches of farmland expanded in pale gold and muted green, and villagers moving slowly across these fields looked as though they belonged to the land as naturally as the crops they tended. Their clothing blended with the scenery earthy browns, washed-out blues, and the muted colors of wool dyed with local plants. In this harmony between people and nature, beauty emerged as a quiet balance, something calm and steady. Inside the cottages, where walls were thick and the air smelled faintly of herbs, the same muted beauty lingered. Many homes hung small bundles of lavender or sage from wooden beams, not for decoration in the modern sense, but simply because it was practical and pleasant. The soft aroma filled the rooms, giving both people and spaces a sense of calm that mirrored the beauty they admired in one another. The scent seemed to slow time, making even the simplest action setting bread on a table, folding a blanket, filling a jug feel like part of a gentle ritual. In noble households, where servants moved in quiet lines, beauty took on a slightly more refined shape but remained subdued. Instead of elaborate jewels or dazzling clothing, elegance manifested in thin details, the way fabric draped in soft folds, the way candles flickered against polished wooden panels, the way steps echoed in long halls with steady, measured rhythm. Even those of higher rank found beauty in calmness, for despite their wealth, the medieval world's pace touched them too. Their beauty was one of subtlety more whispered than declared. In the monasteries, where the world grew even quieter, beauty transformed into something spiritual. Monks believed that inner peace was reflected outward, and thus the calmness of their faces. The slowness of their gestures, the softness of their whispered prayers became a kind of beauty itself. They copied manuscripts by candlelight, their strokes gentle and deliberate. Anyone watching them, even silently from afar, might think they moved with the serene rhythm of drifting snow. Their tranquility added yet another layer to medieval beauty, the beauty of stillness. On some evenings, travelers arrived from far regions, bringing stories of different lands and different ideals. Yet even their tales, though fascinating, often faded into the slow air of the village, becoming part of its sleepy essence. People listened with quiet interest, but their own gentle values remained steady. They were not stirred by exotic descriptions or by distant customs. In the medieval mind, beauty was local, simple, familiar, woven from the everyday, from the repeating patterns of life that remained the same year after year. The villagers did not compare themselves to the outside world. They simply existed in their own soft landscape of calm expectations. Time itself moved slowly, almost drowsily. Days blended into weeks, weeks into seasons. And throughout this quiet passage, beauty remained unchanging, a steady companion that sat beside them in silence. It was not something they sought to improve or perfect. It did not weigh upon them or distract them. It was simply there, like the soft warmth of the sun on a mild morning or the distant sound of a shepherd calling to his flock. At night, when the villagers returned to their homes and the world darkened under the medieval sky, they often felt the presence of beauty in the soft glow of embers in the fireplace. The dim reddish light played gently across the wooden floors, making everything look warm and serene. People sat quietly, listening to the faint crackle of burning wood, the slow breathing of family members, the muffled sounds of animals settling into sleep outside. Their hearts softened, their minds slowed, and beauty quiet, ancient, and steady wrapped itself around them like a woolen blanket. It was in these final moments before sleep, when the world felt stillest, that medieval beauty felt most present. In the slow closing of eyelids, in the last murmured words exchanged, in the warmth of glow against stone walls. Beauty in this world was not a spark. It was the quiet fading of day into night, the gentle meeting of rest, and routine, the peaceful understanding that every face, every gesture, every movement held its own soft charm. And so, the story of medieval beauty drifted on, just as the world itself drifted on, without hurry, without change, without noise. It continued like a slow, endless lullaby carried by the wind, soothing all who listened, calming all who lived within its reach, wrapping the medieval world in an eternal dream of quiet, unspoken grace. And so the village drifted into yet another pale afternoon, where the sun draped itself lazily across the rooftops, and the same gentle murmur of daily tasks hummed on. The people, still wrapped in their quiet preoccupation with medieval beauty ideals, continued their routines without urgency, as though time itself had grown drowsy from watching them. The cobbler, who had been thinking about the perfect proportion of noses all morning, finally sighed and returned to stitching shoes. He had long ago concluded that the ideal nose was whatever shape made it easier for someone to breathe while walking uphill, but he still found himself pondering the matter whenever the day grew too still. As he sewed, he imagined the faces of old portraits' faces with long noses, short noses, slightly crooked noses, and realized none of them had ever changed the weather, the harvest, or the comfort of shoes. This thought soothed him deeply. Across the lane, the baker adjusted her cloth cap again, pulling it low across her forehead. She used to worry that her brow was too wide to be considered alluring by medieval standards, but now she simply focused on kneading dough slowly, gently, rhythmically. The soft motion loosened all her thoughts, until they drifted into a haze like flour in the air. One customer asked her what made a forehead beautiful, in her opinion, and she shrugged with the slightest yawn, saying she no longer remembered. All she cared about was whether the dough rose properly. Somehow the customer found this answer comforting. By the well, two old women resumed their endless discussion about hair that was too dull, or too bright, or too thin, or too unruly. They had repeated the same conversation every day for years. Yet, as the sun glimmered across the surface of the well water, they noticed how their reflections blurred in the ripples. The moving water made every strand of hair look softer, gentler, almost dreamlike. They stared for a long moment, realizing that beauty, when seen through water, seemed far simpler to satisfy. One of them whispered that perhaps the water knew something they didn't, something about how appearances didn't stay still long enough to matter. Meanwhile, the distant murmur of the forest blended with the low rustle of cloaks as villagers passed each other on narrow pathways. They greeted one another with slow nods, barely lifting their eyes as though conserving energy for the quiet act of existing. Their thoughts meandered toward beauty, how medieval eyebrows were once plucked thin or allowed to grow wild, how cheeks were sometimes tinted with crushed berries, how hands were judged by softness or strength. But these thoughts drifted away as quickly as they came, carried off like dry leaves in an idle breeze. At the small wooden schoolhouse, an elderly monk continued his lecture about classical beauty ideals, though half his students were already dozing. His voice moved with the softness of falling dust as he recited old beliefs about symmetrical faces and clear skin. Yet even he, halfway through his own lecture, paused to rub his eyes and confess that he had forgotten why people cared so much. All he remembered was that crops grew when watered, and people felt kindness when treated gently. The students nodded in agreement, those who were still awake enough to nod. The distant church bell rang once, then twice, so slowly that it seemed unsure whether to ring a third time. The sound spread through the town in a soft wave, causing chickens to shuffle sleepily and a few dogs to stretch before settling back down. The whole village seemed to breathe in unison, like a living creature settling deeper into a nap. Even the travelers resting at the inn had begun to drift with the quiet medieval rhythm. Their conversation about what beauty meant in the lands they had visited turned into soft mumbling, then trailing whispers, then nothing at all as they leaned back in their chairs. One traveler, who had spent years crossing mountains and coasts, finally admitted that the only standard of beauty he valued was the relief of removing heavy boots after a long journey. Everyone agreed this was a reasonable and universal truth. As the sky dimmed toward early evening, the castle's torchlighters moved through the stone corridors with slow, careful steps. They lit the torches one by one, watching each flame flicker to life. For centuries, kings and queens had upheld meticulous expectations for appearance, smooth skin, straight posture, elegant movements. But tonight, as the flames cast soft amber glows across the walls, even the royal portraits seemed to blur, their once regal faces smoothing into simple shapes. The torchlighters noticed how the shadows softened sharp lines until even the proudest chins looked gentle and unimportant. Outside the castle gates, a shepherd leaning on his crook let his flock wander lazily along the hillside. He had never understood why people cared so much about beauty standards, medieval or otherwise. His sheep judged no one. They simply existed chewing grass, unconcerned with the proportions of their woolly companions. Watching them, he felt a calmness settle over him, as though the simplicity of sheep was contagious. Beauty, he decided, was probably nothing more than peacefulness. The wind grew softer still as it moved across the valley. It brushed against rooftops, fields, and the wooden beams of homes. The air seemed to whisper the same message it whispered every evening, that the world was far quieter than any standard could ever express. The villagers, hearing this wind, loosened their shoulders and let their thoughts drift without direction. And slowly, without anyone noticing, the conversation about medieval beauty standards faded from every corner of the village. No one remembered who started the topic that morning, and no one asked when it ended. It simply dissolved, the way morning mist dissolves when the sun rises. Yet life went on in its gentle, sleepy way. People continued tending fields, baking bread, carrying buckets of water, brushing their hair, adjusting their cloaks, and standing in doorways watching the sky change colors. They still lived by customs older than their grandparents, and those customs still shaped what they admired or critiqued. But everything felt softened now, quieter, slower, easier to ignore. The day stretched itself like a tired cat across the last bit of light. And though beauty standards existed, as they always had, the village floated beyond them now, drifting into that familiar medieval stillness where nothing was too urgent, too important, or too sharp to disturb the calm. The story continued to drift, just as you drift, gently, effortlessly. As twilight settled over the village, everything seemed to move with an even slower breath. The soft glow of the fading sun stretched across the rooftops like a blanket being pulled over a resting child. Every cobblestone, every wooden beam, every quiet doorway seemed to exhale with the ending of the day. The villagers, lulled by the long afternoon of wandering thoughts about medieval beauty standards, now felt a deeper calm taking hold. Their minds moved like drifting feathers, settling wherever they pleased without urgency or direction. The old tailor, who had spent decades stitching garments according to shifting ideals, sat outside his shop with a needle still tucked behind his ear. He watched the sky turn a deeper shade of blue, and he wondered whether anyone would care if sleeves were wide or narrow, long or short. In his youth, he had followed every trend diligently, believing that clothing could shape opinions. But now, as he gazed at the peaceful horizon, he felt no attachment to any of it. He realized that beauty, in all its medieval rigidity, had never altered the taste of supper or the softness of sleep. Near the carpenter's workshop, the sound of sanding drifted through the air like a distant sigh. The carpenter, smoothing a plank of oak, paused to examine his hands, strong, rough, marked with tiny scars from years of work. In the past, some villagers admired smooth hands, while others admired calloused ones. He had never understood which was correct, and now he didn't bother trying. The wood beneath his fingers felt steady and familiar, and that was enough. He let the day fade around him, the repetitive motion becoming almost hypnotic. In the center of the square, a young girl sat by the fountain, dipping her fingers into the cool water and watching the ripples expand. She had heard older women talk about beauty, the shape of faces, the paleness of skin, the height of cheekbones, but the water showed her something different. When she looked into it, her reflection wavered gently, becoming soft, then softer still, until it resembled nothing at all. She liked it that way. The reflection seemed free from expectations, floating like a dream across the water's surface. A traveling peddler passed through the village gates, his cart creaking softly as he entered the square. He carried trinkets, powders, combs, and polished mirrors, all items meant to enhance appearance according to old customs. But as he watched the villagers move slowly and quietly through their routines, he felt no urge to set up a stall. Instead, he parked his cart beneath a tree and allowed his eyes to close for a moment. The peace of the village made his goods feel unnecessary, as though the very air whispered that no one needed anything more than rest. In the long corridor of the castle, a maid walked past tall tapestries depicting queens and noble ladies known for their beauty. She glanced at their faces, stiff, painted, adorned, but felt no envy, no comparison. The dim light made the threadwork fade into muted shades, and the faces seemed almost sleepy themselves. She imagined them stepping out of the tapestries, not to pose or parade, but simply to sit beside her, share a quiet moment, and forget their roles entirely. Outside, the shepherd lit a lantern as the first stars appeared. His sheep gathered close, their wool glowing faintly in the dim light. He rubbed his hands together and listened to the gentle sounds of nighttime settling in, the rustling grass, the soft bleating, the distant hoot of an owl. These sounds were more comforting than any outward idea of beauty. In their simple, natural rhythm, he found a deeper sense of harmony. A group of children chased fireflies in the nearby field. Every now and then, one of them would try to catch a glimmering speck of light, but the fireflies always drifted just out of reach. The children laughed, but softly, their voices blending with the quiet evening. They were too caught up in the gentle wonder of the moment to think about appearances. In their innocence, beauty was simply the glow of tiny wings in the dusk. Back in the village square, the innkeeper lit lanterns along the wooden beams of his establishment. As the warm light spread, it softened every line, every shadow, making faces appear warmer, kinder, more at ease. Guests leaned back in their chairs, savoring the quiet. No one spoke of standards or ideals or expectations. They simply existed, breathing slowly, letting the evening cradle them. Even the old scholar in the tower, who once studied medieval beliefs about proportion and symmetry, closed his book. He set it aside with a tired smile, realizing that no amount of research could capture the simple truth unfolding around him. Beauty, he thought, was never meant to be measured. It was something felt, not seen. And so, as night continued to deepen, the village sank into its familiar dreamlike stillness. Torches flickered. Crickets chirped. Window shutters creaked softly in the breeze. And all thoughts of medieval beauty standards, once so important, faded into the gentle, endless quiet that wrapped the village like a soft cloak. Everything slowed. Everything softened. Everything drifted. The night unfolded gently, like a long ribbon unfurling across the sky. The last hints of daylight faded behind the hills, and the village slipped fully into its quiet rhythm, a rhythm older than memory, steady as a heartbeat, soft as worn wool. Along the narrow path behind the mill, an elderly man walked with a lantern in hand. Its glow flickered faintly on the stones. He wasn't walking for any purpose. He simply liked the feel of cool air on his face at dusk. As he walked, he remembered the old beliefs about beautiful posture and graceful movement, the expectations that people should walk with straight backs and careful steps. Tonight, though, he let his shoulders sag comfortably. His steps were slow, uneven but calm, each one carrying him deeper into the stillness of the evening. Nothing about him matched medieval ideals, yet nothing felt out of place. Nearby, a soft wind rustled through the herb garden behind the apothecary. The plants, rosemary, thyme, sage, and mint shivered gently. Their scent drifted through the air like a soothing whisper. The apothecary, who had once sold ointments and powders meant to lighten skin or soften wrinkles, now spent more time tending the herbs simply because their presence felt peaceful. He breathed in the fragrance and allowed it to settle his mind, pushing away stray thoughts about appearances. Out here, under the slow arc of the sky, beauty felt like nothing more than the scent of green leaves in the night. Down the lane, a cat curled lazily on a stone doorstep, its tail twitching with drowsy contentment. The villagers often admired cats for their sleekness or their symmetry, believing elegant animals possessed a kind of natural grace. But this cat was plump and unevenly colored, with one ear slightly folded from an old scuffle. Still, as it settled comfortably into sleep, it looked more serene than any perfect creature in any illuminated manuscript. Its calmness spread outward, making the entire doorstep seem like a small island of peace. Inside one of the cottages, a woman brushed her hair beside a dim candle. Medieval beauty standards often praised long, smooth hair, carefully maintained and neatly braided. But her hair was tangled from the long day, and she brushed it slowly, not to perfect it, but simply to feel the soft pull of the comb. Each stroke was unhurried, each movement quiet, as she watched the strands glow faintly in the candlelight. She felt no pressure to style it for admiration. The act of brushing itself became an almost meditative ritual. In the nearby barn, a farmhand finished stacking the last bundles of hay. His hands were dirty, his boots worn, and his shirt creased from hours of work. Medieval ideals sometimes spoke of handsome workers, strong arms, clean attire, controlled expressions, but he felt none of that mattered. The animals didn't care, the moon didn't care, and the night certainly didn't. When he closed the barn door and leaned against it for a moment, he felt the day's weight fall away like dust from his sleeves. At the village outskirts, a narrow stream wound through soft grass. Fireflies floated above it, their lights blinking gently, as though in slow conversation. A shepherd's daughter sat by the water with her knees drawn close, listening to its soft gurgle. She had heard people debate what made a face beautiful, the shape of a chin, the spacing of eyes, the arch of brows, but here none of that mattered. The stream reflected her features back at her in wavering lines, stretching them, softening them, reshaping them without meaning. She dipped her fingertips into the cool water and watched the reflections ripple away. It felt freeing, gentle, dreamlike. At the inn, the last of the guests finished their supper and leaned back in their chairs, lulled by warmth and quiet. In medieval courts, beauty had often been associated with elegance, conversation, posture, even the way one held a goblet. But in this simple inn with soft lanterns swaying gently overhead, no one bothered to appear elegant. People sat however they wished, slouched, relaxed, half asleep. A few murmured about the long day of travel. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the atmosphere wrap around them. The innkeeper polished a mug slowly, his movements lazy, almost rhythmic. He could remember when travelers asked eagerly for mirrors to fix their hair or straighten their clothing. But these days, most guests seemed far more interested in comfort than presentation. The innkeeper's own hair stuck out in odd directions, a detail he barely noticed. The quiet evening made appearances feel like distant concerns, lost beneath layers of tranquility. Up at the castle, a scribe worked by candlelight, copying a manuscript that described kings and queens famed for their beauty. His quill moved at a leisurely pace, dipping, gliding, pausing. He read old descriptions: ivory skin, golden hair, flawless form, but as he copied the words, they felt strangely disconnected from reality. He glanced out the window at the village below, soft by shadows and moonlight. Not a single face needed perfection to fit into the serenity of the night. The world looked beautiful in its unpolished stillness. Somewhere in the forest beyond the fields, an owl hooted softly, its voice carried by the breeze. The sound flowed into the village like a lullaby, blending with the chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. It made everything feel slowed, suspended, dreamy. The moon climbed higher, silvering rooftops and illuminating pathways with a faint glow. It touched every face, every hand, every wall without judgment or favoritism. Under moonlight, all people looked the same, washed gently in pale light, softened into calm silhouettes. Thoughts of medieval beauty standards, once so full of rules and opinions, now floated like distant echoes, fading into the night. The villagers no longer compared or evaluated. They simply existed, wrapped in the soft stillness that blanketed everything. The night deepened, the air cooled, the world settled. And the story, like the village, drifted ever further into peaceful quiet. The moon hung higher now, round and silent, as though watching over the village with a patient, gentle gaze. Its pale light spilled across rooftops and fields, turning the world into a quiet landscape of silver and shadow. Every sound in the night seemed softened, carried far, but lightly like footsteps on wool. Near the village square, the blacksmith finally set down his tools after a long day. His strong arms, marked with smoke and soot, did not match the refined ideals once admired in noble courts, where smooth skin and delicate hands were prized. But the blacksmith hardly remembered such things anymore. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, listened to the faint hum of the cooling forge. Beauty felt irrelevant beside the steady warmth of honest work. At the well, two neighbors met by coincidence. Both carried empty buckets, and both moved with the slow pace of people who had no reason to rush. They exchanged a small nod, then turned the creaking winch to lower the rope. As the bucket descended, they watched their reflections shimmer in the dark water below. The ripples made their faces stretch, then shrink, then blur completely. Instead of correcting their hair or smoothing their clothes, they simply watched the water, entranced by how quietly it moved, how effortlessly it erased detail. Somehow that felt more comforting than any mirror. A dog trotted lazily across the square, its ears drooping, its tail wagging half-heartedly in a relaxed rhythm. In medieval times, Dogs owned by nobles were often groomed to look pristine, with combed fur and decorative ribbons. But this village dog wore nothing but the dust of the path and the calmness of a full belly. The villagers adored it nonetheless. It paused to sniff a patch of grass before curling up beside the indoor, where warm air seeped through the cracks. Within moments, the dog slipped into sleep, its breathing deep and slow, like the lull of a distant tide. Inside one of the cottages, an elderly woman sorted dried flowers on her table: lavender, chamomile, yarrow. In her youth, she had used such flowers to create tinctures believed to enhance beauty, waters for smoother skin, salves for softer hands. Tonight, though, she arranged the blossoms simply to enjoy their faint scent. Her wrinkled fingers moved gently over the petals, and she felt no desire to restore youth or reverse the marks of time. The lines on her face, softened by the candlelight, told stories far more comforting than any youthful glow ever could. Farther down the lane, a man repairing a fishing net hummed a tune so slow and monotone that it sounded like part of the night itself. Medieval tales had once praised strong fishermen with proud stances and sharp jawlines, heroes admired for their rugged looks. But this fisherman sat slouched on a stool, completely absorbed in the simple task of looping string through string. His features looked peaceful in the dim glow of his lantern, not heroic, not impressive, just quietly human. Along the outer road, a group of travelers made camp beneath an old oak tree. They built a small fire, though its flames remained low, flickering gently as if whispering stories to the night. One traveler stared into the fire, reflecting on the many lands he had crossed, each with its own ideas of beauty, some valuing pale skin, others sun-darkened complexions, some praising slender frames, others broad shoulders. But now, as he warmed his hands at the flames, all those differences felt trivial, washed away by the simplicity of firelight and silence. In a loft above a stable, a boy lay on a pile of hay, gazing up at the beams overhead. He had heard about medieval ideals of beauty, how noble children were encouraged to sit with perfect posture, to keep their hair neat, to speak with grace. But he preferred this loft, where straw stuck to his clothes and his hair was never tidy. He liked watching shadows dance across the wood as the lantern below flickered. He liked how the night felt endless and uncomplicated. Out in a meadow just beyond the village, the grass swayed gently in the breeze. A few young villagers had wandered there to escape the warmth of crowded homes. They lay in the soft grass, arms folded behind their heads, watching stars drift into view. None of them breathed a word about appearance. The stars were the only things anyone cared to look at. Their cold, distant light made every earthly worry seem faint and unimportant. A soft mist began to rise from the ground, curling around fences and pathways. It wrapped the village in a pale veil, softening the shapes of buildings, blurring the edges of shadows. Under this mist, everything looked gentle, hushed, muted. Even the harshest outlines became tender, as if the night itself wanted to erase every expectation, smoothing the world into calm. The torches along the castle walls burned steadily, their flames fluttering but never faltering. Guards walked slowly, their armor clinking faintly in the dark. They too knew of the old ideals, how knights were once expected to be as handsome as they were brave. But now, as they paced under the moon, they cared more about warmth, company, and the soft promise of dawn. The village breathed as one slow, deep, rhythmic. Beauty standards, once so rigid and spoken of with such certainty, now drifted like loose clouds, forgotten by the world below. The people no longer compared, judged, or measured. The quiet night had washed those thoughts away, tucking them into corners where no one would look, and the story continued to soften, and the village continued to settle, and the night continued to deepen. Nearby, a candle flickered in a narrow window of the weaver's cottage. Inside, the weaver sat at her loom, though she had stopped working hours ago. The threads hung loose, waiting for her hands, but she was in no hurry. She simply gazed at them, tracing their muted colors with her eyes. But as the cows dozed beneath the moonlight, indistinguishable shapes among the dark fields, it was clear none of them cared. Their sleepy sighs drifted into the air like warm, gentle notes. Back in the village, a potter finished cleaning his tools and stepped outside, stretching his tired arms. He looked down at his hands marked with clay, stiff from work, and recalled how medieval people once admired elegant fingers, delicate wrists, immaculate nails. But he found comfort in the earthiness of his hands, in the way clay clung to them like a familiar companion. He wiped them on his apron and felt no desire to scrub them clean. The night didn't mind, and neither did he. In one quiet house, a mother sat with her young daughter beside the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the room in a deep, warm red. The girl yawned, her eyes drooping, her hair messy from play. The mother gently tucked a stray curl behind her ear. Now, in the thickening night, those old whispers thinned until they were nothing more than soft threads of memory. A gentle wind drifted down the main road, carrying the faint fragrance of hearth smoke, earth, and distant pine. The breeze, like everything else, moved slowly, so slowly it seemed to rock the entire village into deeper rest. On the castle balcony, a lady stood wrapped in a shawl, gazing at the land below. She had spent much of her life learning the rules of noble beauty, how to sit, how to speak, how to smile in the most flattering way. But out here, under the vast dome of the night, she felt those lessons drift away, becoming as meaningless as dust floating in moonlight. She rested her chin on her hand, breathing deeply. For the first time that day, she let her posture relax completely, and it felt like shedding a weight she had carried for years. Far in the fields, a lone lantern moved belonging to a shepherd making one last round before sleep. His steps were unhurried, his thoughts even slower. He hummed a tune passed down through generations, one with notes so simple they barely counted as a melody. The sheep grazed peacefully, their wool glowing faintly in the lantern light. The shepherd knew nothing of beauty standards. He only knew the soft comfort of night sounds and the familiar shape of the land beneath his feet. The hours passed gently, unmarked by urgency. The village sank deeper, quieter, softer, wrapped in the kind of silence that only old places know. Silence shaped by time, by routine, by lives lived slowly. The moon stayed patient. The mists stayed low, and the people drifted, breathing in and out with the gentle rhythm of a world where beauty no longer mattered at all. The night eased into an even quieter stillness, as though the world itself had settled into a deep breath it had been holding for centuries. The moonlight lay across the village like a thin blanket of silver. smoothing every roof, every path, every field into gentle shapes without edges. Near the edge of the village, an elderly shepherdess sat on a low wooden stool, mending a small tear in her wool cloak. Her stitches were slow, almost dreamlike, looping in and out of the fabric with no urgency. In her younger years, she remembered hearing that neat stitches were a sign of refinement, a mark of beauty and household skill. But tonight, the thread slipped softly through the cloth, uneven and relaxed, as she found the imperfection comforting. Each pull of the needle felt like a quiet heartbeat. A lantern flickered in the bakery window, where the baker had left dough rising for the morning. The faint glow made the flour dust in the air sparkle like a drifting constellation. The baker leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his apron, thinking about nothing in particular. Medieval tailies had once praised round, rosy faces as signs of health and beauty, but he didn't think about his appearance at all. He watched the dough rise, watched the shadows dance, and allowed his mind to empty, as soft and hollow as a cooling loaf. Down the old cobbled lane, the candles in the healer's house burned low. She moved slowly between shelves filled with jars, lavender water, rose hips, honeysuckles steeped in oil. These were once prized as remedies for beauty, meant to brighten the complexion or smooth the skin. But her hands now lingered over them not out of vanity, but because their faint scents made her breathing slower, calmer. She lifted a jar of chamomile and inhaled its gentle sweetness, letting her shoulders droop a little more. The scent felt like a lullaby woven from petals. Near the barn, the stable boy finished brushing a drowsy horse. Its coat, once expected to shine for visiting nobles, was now dusty from the day's work. The horse lowered its head and nudged his shoulder softly, the way creatures do when comfort matters more than appearance. The boy smiled and leaned his forehead against the horse's warm neck. They stood together in the dim glow, the world outside fading into nothing but quiet breathing and the soft rustle of hay. A soft breeze floated across the fields, bending the tall grass in slow, gentle waves. At the far end of the meadow, a small group of villagers sat on an old fallen log, their voices low and unhurried. They remembered a time when people spoke of ideal features, ideal forms, comparisons whispered like secrets. But those conversations felt distant now, almost forgotten. Instead, they talked about the weather, the crops, the stars, topics that drifted through the night without weight or worry. At the castle gate, the guard leaned on his spear and let his eyes half close. His armor no longer gleamed the way knight's armor was once polished for court parades. A faint smudge of dust clung to the metal, softening its shine. He didn't bother to wipe it away. The stillness of the night pressed gently around him, and he found himself drifting in and out of thought, not fully awake, not fully asleep, but somewhere comfortably in between. In a nearby cottage, a father told his children a bedtime story, his voice low, steady, soothing. The tale meandered with no real plot, no excitement, just the soft rhythm of words meant to lull rather than entertain. The children purled deeper into their blankets, eyelids fluttering. Medieval beauty standards once insisted on upright posture and proper manners even for the young, but here, in the safe warmth of home, the children sprawled in the most ungraceful, comfortable ways imaginable. And it felt perfect. Behind the tavern, a musician sat with his lute resting on his lap. He plucked a few quiet notes, each one stretching long, fading into the night like thin smoke. In another life, he might have played lively tunes to impress travelers, hoping to be seen, to be admired. But this evening, he played only for himself, letting the slow melody drift without structure or purpose. The gentle vibrations of the strings blended into the air until even the musician could barely tell where the sound ended and the night began. Up on the grassy hill beyond the village, the old astronomer stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He gazed at the sky where the stars trembled faintly in the cool air. In medieval courts, it was said that symmetrical faces were a sign of celestial favor, a reflection of the heaven's perfection. But the astronomer, watching the sky he had studied all his life, knew that even the stars themselves flickered imperfectly, and yet they were beautiful. Their uneven glow soothed him, reminding him that comfort often lived in the simplest, quietest things. The village breathed deeply once more, slow, easy, calm. The mist clung to the earth. The moon drifted higher. And all thoughts of beauty standards melted into the night, dissolving like grains of sugar in warm water. The world sank deeper and deeper into its soft, endless quiet. The night deepened further, stretching like soft velvet across the hills and valleys. Every roof, every lane, every field lay wrapped in shadow, softened by moonlight and the lingering mist. Even the faintest sounds, the clink of a lantern, the rustle of a cloak, seemed muffled, as if the air itself were heavy with drowsiness. In the quiet orchard beyond the village, the fruit trees swayed slowly. Apples hung low, their skin reflecting the pale moonlight. Leaves whispered softly in the gentle wind. The orchard keeper walked between the trees, hands brushing lightly against the rough bark. In earlier days, villagers had sometimes judged the keeper's neatness, the smoothness of her hair or the brightness of her eyes. Tonight none of that mattered. She inhaled the cool night air, listened to the distant call of an owl, and let her mind float like the shadows among the branches. By the small bridge over the lazy stream, the fisherman leaned on his rod, watching the water slide quietly past. Medieval tailies had long praised strong arms and steady hands as signs of beauty and competence. But the fisherman, feeling the soft sway of the wooden bridge under his weight, realized that patience was far more important than appearance. His hands, rough and scarred, moved gently over the line as he checked the knots. The water rippled in response, carrying a calmness that seemed to seep into every muscle, every thought, every breath. Inside a candlelit cottage, a seamstress folded her linen slowly. Once, she had spent days pressing the folds of cloth until they were perfect, believing neatness alone could reflect beauty. But tonight she let the folds remain imperfect, soft, relaxed. She felt a quiet pleasure in the uneven edges, in the small folds that looked like they had settled themselves naturally. The candle flickered across her hands and she traced the light with her eyes, finding contentment in the slow rhythm of the moment. Outside the inn, a cat padded silently across the cobblestones, tail curling gently. In brighter hours, villagers might have praised its sleekness or its symmetrical markings. But tonight, the cat seemed to move like a shadow, effortless, unjudged, perfect only in its calm, quiet way. It leapt onto a low wall and settled into a curl, breathing slowly, mirroring the world around it. A group of children slept in a loft above the bakery, small bodies curled beneath blankets. Medieval standards had once insisted that even children should behave and sit gracefully, but here they lay tangled together, blankets askew, hair sticking out in every direction. The soft warmth of the hay beneath them, the faint smell of bread from below, and the distant hum of the wind made everything gentle. The adults in the village passed the loft quietly, careful not to disturb the deep, peaceful breaths of the sleeping children. Near the old well, a grandmother sat quietly, weaving thin strands of straw into simple patterns. Her hands moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, in a rhythm learned over decades. In medieval manuals, she had read that symmetry in weaving reflected skill and even moral virtue. But tonight, she let her hands wander freely, creating uneven, soft shapes that pleased no one but herself. The patterns were imperfect, yes, but they carried a quiet joy, a kind of beauty that needed no approval. At the far end of the village, the church bells waited in silence, their clappers still. In medieval ceremonies, bells had been rung to mark pageantry, triumph, or important occasions often connected to the appearance and status of those attending. But now, the bells remained still, resting through the night along with everything else. Their dormant presence seemed to echo the slow, unhurried rhythm of the world, a gentle reminder that time itself could pause and breathe. In the castle, the scribe rested his quill beside the parchment. The images of kings and queens he had copied so diligently, faces judged for perfection, looked strangely muted in the flickering candlelight. The grandeur he had once associated with beauty seemed distant, irrelevant, almost dreamlike. He leaned back in his chair, letting his thoughts float slowly, untethered, imagining the entire village and all its people drifting into the same soft, timeless night. The wind carried the faint scent of herbs, baking bread, and fresh hay through the lanes, wrapping the village in a quiet warmth. The stars, scattered across the sky, blinked slowly, unevenly, like eyes half asleep. Even the heavens seemed to pause, reflecting the gentle calm that had settled across the land. The villagers, animals, and travelers all moved with the same soft rhythm, unconcerned with beauty, perfection, or expectation. Even the distant mountains and winding rivers seemed to echo the same gentle lull, their forms soft by moonlight and mist. Time itself had slowed, drawn into the soft, endless rhythm of night, and the world, as always, drifted deeper. Midnight had begun its quiet reign. The moon had climbed high into the sky, casting a silver haze over the rooftops, the fields, and the winding lanes. The mist had thickened just enough to blur edges, turning every familiar shape into a soft, indistinct silhouette. Even the cobblestones seemed rounded by the gentle darkness, their rough surfaces transformed into smooth pathways for wandering thoughts. Near the edge of the village, the miller closed the creaking wheel and leaned against the worn timber frame. The water churned lazily below, each ripple reflecting the moonlight like faint moving silver threads. In earlier days, villagers had praised the symmetry of hands, the brightness of eyes, or the smoothness of skin as markers of beauty. Tonight, though, the miller found no need to consider any of it. He breathed in the cool night air, feeling the pulse of the stream, the weight of the quiet, and the gentle pause of everything around him. In the orchard, the keeper leaned her head against a low branch, eyes half closed. She let her fingers drift over rough bark, over leaves coated in dew. The soft scent of apples and earth filled her senses. Medieval rules might have dictated neat hair and orderly posture, but her hair fell freely, her body slumped comfortably against the tree. Nothing felt wrong, nothing demanded correction. Everything was soft, slow, and adequate. In the square, the tavern's windows glowed faintly. Inside, the last guests sat with mugs of warm ale, voices muted to whispers. The fire sputtered low in the hearth, casting shadows that stretched lazily across the walls. Medieval tailies had once insisted that a proper posture and poised gestures reflected one's inner worth. But tonight, no one cared. The travelers leaned back in their chairs, their heads tilting, their shoulders loose. Every clink of a mug and every sigh became part of the lull of the night. At the well, the grandmother's weaving hands moved slowly, rhythmically, almost trance-like. Each strand of straw slipped between her fingers without tension, forming patterns that needed no symmetry, no approval. The strands curled and twisted naturally, as though guided by the night itself. Each imperfect loop felt more satisfying than any precise repetition could ever have been. Out in the fields, the shepherd checked the flock one last time. Sheep huddled together under the low moon, their breaths misting faintly in the cool air. He adjusted his lantern, letting it sway lightly without concern for straight lines or brightness. The sheep paid him no attention, unconcerned with beauty or expectation. Their quiet presence reassured him, filling his thoughts with a gentle emptiness that was somehow complete. Even the animals within the village participated in this quiet, unremarkable rhythm. Cats stretched on windowsills, dogs lay sprawled across the road, chickens slept under the eaves, their soft coos fading into the night. The quiet was perfect, not demanding, not dazzling, not structured. It existed simply because the night had chosen it. In the castle, the scribe finally closed his manuscript and let his quill rest. The faces he had copied, the kings and queens lauded for symmetry and refinements, seemed softened in the candlelight, their rigid features mellowed into calm silhouettes. He leaned back and closed his eyes, breathing the faint scent of ink and parchment. Medieval ideals of beauty no longer mattered here, not in the shadowed corridors of stone and torchlight, not in the quiet heart of the night. High above, stars twinkled unevenly, some brighter, some fainter, all drifting slowly in the dark sky. Even the heavens seemed to reflect the gentle, imperfect, patient rhythm that the village now carried. Every tree, every stone, every roof, every sleeping inhabitant was part of the same quiet hum, a lullaby without melody, a poem without words. The air grew cooler, wrapping the village in a soft embrace. The wind, barely perceptible, brushed the rooftops, swayed the herbs and windowsills, and whispered through the open fields. Every living creature from humans to livestock to the smallest insect moved in a dreamlike cadence, following the invisible beat of night itself. The world had slowed, the night had deepened, and the village, wrapped in mist, moonlight, and the endless rhythm of time, drifted into the deepest, quietest stillness. The village lay entirely still now, as though the earth itself had exhaled and decided to pause. Even the faintest sounds, footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the creak of shutters, had softened to nothing more than whispers. Every rooftop, every cobblestone, every patch of grass seemed rounded by shadow, every edge mellowed by moonlight and mist. By the stream, The fisherman leaned his rod against a stone and sat quietly, letting the gentle lapping of water fill the space around him. His hands rested on his knees, scarred and worn from years of labor, no longer judged by anyone, not even himself. The water moved slowly, lazily, carrying reflections of the moon that shimmered and wavered like silver smoke. Nothing about the night demanded effort, perfection, or attention, only presence, only calm. In the orchard, the keeper's hands rested lightly against the branches, feeling the slight tremor of leaves in the cool night air. She listened to the wind weaving through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of apples, grass, and earth. Medieval rules of beauty, neat hair, upright posture, refined gestures seemed as distant as tales whispered centuries ago. Here, she could simply exist, free of judgment, and the night felt full in its own gentle way. Near the square, the inn was quiet except for the slow crackle of the dying fire. A few travelers leaned back in chairs, their eyes half closed, bodies settling into the rhythm of night. No one spoke of appearances or standards. Their mugs rested on the table like small, comforting weights, and their thoughts floated, unanchored. The warmth of the fire, the soft glow of the lanterns, the faint hum of wind outside. The world was enough, exactly as it was. In a nearby cottage, the seamstress traced her fingers over the folds of linen once more. The fabric, imperfect, uneven, unmeasured, comforted her. She let the cloth rest, letting each wrinkle and crease remain as it pleased. Beauty, once demanded by distant standards, had dissolved into the simple, unhurried satisfaction of quiet labor and attention to small mundane acts. Out in the pasture, the sheep huddled closer together, their soft breaths rising like mist. The shepherd's lantern cast a faint glow over the field, and he moved among the flock without hurry or thought of form or ideal. Each step he took was deliberate in its slowness, and every movement of the animals echoed the same gentle tempo. It was as though the night had taught them all a quiet meditation and unspoken shared harmony. The church bell tower, tall and silent, watched over the village like a patient sentinel. The bells, dormant until dawn, seemed to hum faintly in the imagination, vibrating with the same slow heartbeat that had spread through the streets and fields. Medieval expectations of grandeur, reverence, or perfect ceremony had vanished into the air, leaving only calm and the deep, steady pulse of night. Above, the stars blinked faintly, unevenly, each one drifting imperceptibly across the heavens. Their quiet, imperfect light mirrored the village below. Every shadow, every figure, every stone softened into gentle forms. Even the mountains in the distance, dark and immovable, seemed to lean slightly, resting in the patient rhythm of the world. In the castle, the scribe finally laid his quill aside. The manuscripts of kings and queens, faces praised for symmetry and elegance, seemed softened by the candlelight, their sharp lines mellowed into restful shapes. He closed his eyes and felt the slow cadence of the night wrap around him, filling him with an unspoken, timeless calm. The wind drifted lazily through the lanes, past the cottages, the fields, the orchard, and the stream. It carried the faint scents of herbs, hay, and earth, brushing across faces and hair like a gentle lullaby. Every living being, villagers, travelers, animals, even the smallest insects, seemed to move in the same soft, dreamlike rhythm. The night deepened into its final, softest hours. The moon had climbed to its highest point, bathing every field, roof, and lane in silver light. The mist lay thick over the village, softening edges, blurring forms, turning every familiar shape into gentle, dreamlike silhouettes. Even the smallest details, cobblestones, thatched roofs, tufts of grass, seemed to dissolve into quiet calm. In the orchard, the keeper's hands rested lightly against the trees, her breath slow and even. The leaves whispered with the faintest rustle, carrying the soft scent of apples and earth. She felt herself melt into the rhythm of the night, as though the world had slowed just to cradle her. There was no need to stand upright, no need to tidy hair or follow any expectation. The night carried everything, and she carried nothing. Near the stream, the fisherman had set aside his rod. He sat on a stone, eyes half closed, listening to the water slip past. The silver reflections of the moon shimmered and drifted lazily on the surface. All thoughts of strength, skill, or outward appearance faded like mist in the morning sun. Only the gentle pulse of the stream, the soft night air, and the steady rhythm of his breathing remained. Inside the cottages, The villagers lay tucked beneath blankets. The seamstress rested her hands on her lap, the linen left unmeasured, imperfect, perfect only in its quiet presence. The children slept deeply, twisted in blankets, sprawled, messy, warm, and safe. The parents and elders leaned back in chairs or against walls, their eyes closed, faces soft by candlelight or moonlight, each one drifting further into rest. Even the animals were caught in the same gentle slowness. Cats curled on windowsills, dogs lay sprawled across the streets, and the sheep huddled together in the pasture, breathing softly in the pale glow of lanterns and moonlight. Nothing moved quickly. Nothing demanded attention. Everything existed simply, softly, peacefully. At the castle, the scribe rested his head against the table. The portraits of kings and queens, praised for beauty and symmetry, seemed distant, blurred, irrelevant. Candlelight softened their features until even the proudest visage appeared gentle, almost sleepy. He allowed himself to drift in that quiet, in that soft unfolding of night, letting the centuries of expectation fall away like dust. Above the village, stars twinkled faintly in uneven, drifting patterns. The mountains and distant forests rested in shadow. The wind moved lazily, brushing over the fields, the rooftops, and the lanes. Every living thing, from humans to animals to the tiniest insect, moved in harmony with the soft, timeless rhythm of the night. Time itself had become slow and tender. All thoughts of medieval beauty, standards, faces, posture, elegance, ideals had faded into irrelevance. They were nothing now but faint echoes, soft as whispers in the wind. The world exhaled one final time. The village, wrapped in moonlight, mist, warmth, and quiet, sank completely into a deep, endless sleep. Nothing rushed, nothing judged, nothing demanded attention. Only calm, only soft, unbroken stillness, only night. And in that night, the village, its people, its animals, and even the stones and rivers themselves rested, completely, perfectly, endlessly at peace.